It was a relatively stormy 2016 in Africa, but there were also some silver linings on the continent. For a brief review of the year that was, here's VOA's Paul Cisco.
October 13th, 21 of more than 200 kidnapped Chibok schoolgirls are freed. They've been held by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria, near the Cameroon border, since April 2014. The UN and others report IDPs, internally displaced persons, reached an all-time high in 2016, and more refugees and migrants died or disappeared in 2016 than in any previous year. As a measure of democratic progress on the continent, there were more than 23 major elections slated for 2016 in Africa, a part of the world where democracy has struggled to take hold. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, where President Joseph Kabila appears willing to hang on to power at all costs. Gambia is on the verge of turmoil. Longtime leader Yahya Jammeh was upset at the polls on December 1st by Adama Barrow. More surprising was Jammeh's initial willing acceptance of the vote. Jammeh declared the vote fraudulent and unacceptable. He's now asking the Electoral Commission for a new vote. Despite last year's peaceful election and transition of power in the Central African Republic, UN monitors say violent clashes are spreading throughout the country. The recently released UN report says the new government has limited control outside the capital, Bangui. Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni won an unprecedented fifth term in disputed elections in February. Since he came to power in 1986, opposition parties have gained a growing share of seats in parliament. But the 2016 electoral process was marred by the arrest of Kizza Besigye and charges of voter irregularities. In Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo will be inaugurated as the West African nation's new president, January 7th. He defeated incumbent President John Mahama of the National Democratic Congress in a peaceful vote December 7th. Zambia's incumbent President Edgar Lungu took the oath of office in September after the nation's top court rejected an opposition petition to block it. Also of note in 2016, a growing movement to withdraw from the ICC. The International Criminal Court was established as the court of last resort to prosecute crimes against humanity. It's accused of racism, focusing on African crimes, and the African Union has urged all its members to pull out. Another ominous 2016 record, a recent report from the UN says armed forces and groups in South Sudan recruited 1,300 child soldiers this year, bringing the total number of children used in fighting since 2013 to more than 17,000. Outgoing UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon again called for a Security Council vote on an arms embargo for South Sudan, saying he fears genocide is imminent unless immediate action is taken there. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Well, thank you, Paul. Now, the United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 5,000 migrants, including many Africans, are believed to have drowned in the Mediterranean Sea in 2016. UNHCR spokesman William Spindler says the alarming increase in deaths this year appeared to be related to bad weather, the declining quality of vessels used by smugglers, and their tactics to avoid detection. The UNHCR appealed to states to open up more legal pathways for admitting refugees, resettlement programs, private sponsorships, family reunification, and student scholarships would help so they do not have to resort to dangerous journeys and the use of smugglers. The International Organization for Migration says nearly 360,000 migrants and refugees had entered Europe by sea by December 21st of 2016, arriving mostly in Greece and Italy. Now, for more perspective on this and other stories that made the headlines, I'm joined by my colleagues Salem Solomon and Jackson Mvunganyi, who will be with us throughout the entire program today. Now, first, really, the three of us spent a lot of time discussing the issue of migrants trying to get to Europe. Salem, if I may begin with you, why do you think this stayed at the very top of the headlines on the continent?
You know, as you introduced it in your introduction, you know, because of the tragedy. It's been the biggest human tragedy of the past year. topping over 5,000 migrants, the death toll of migrants over 5,000. In fact, IOM is saying that 7,189 migrants, including refugees, are either missing or dead just this past year. So the magnitude of the death toll really highlights why this story continues to be on top of...
I agree with her. I agree totally with Salem. You know, we've talked about this before, and I think one of the reasons why this story continues to make headlines is the staggering number of people that continue to die on these waters as they cross over to Europe, and that, you know, we hoped that by talking about it and highlighting some of these issues that we would see a decline in numbers for whatever reason. You know, in the story they said one of the reasons why people are crossing over to Europe was because of changing weather, you know, patterns, or, you know, they're fleeing with droughts and things of that nature. But honestly, it's 2016. People shouldn't be fleeing because of weather changes.
But also, I think one of the other reasons why this story really stayed with us is that throughout the year, we really didn't see any realistic resolution to the problem.
Right.
That's
I mean,
true.
there were all ideas floated. There were things on the table in Europe. They had conferences. But, you know, Salem, we didn't see, especially from the continent, any real kind of plan to resolve the problem.
That's right. I want to bring a little bit of perspective of what Europe is trying to do to curb the migration problem. In spring 2015, European Union had an emergency meeting to talk about how to curb migration coming from African countries. And so they had a 10-point action plan where they talked about how to invest, talking about pouring money into the problem, basically. One example we can think about just this past year, is Niger got over 600 million euros just to make sure that the migrants and refugees don't cross the Mediterranean. This is just one example. Other examples we can think of go as far as countries in Ethiopia, for instance, where second and third countries where migrants pass through. And so they would create like agricultural or other industries so that migrants would have jobs in order not to, you know, in order to make sure that unemployment doesn't cause, or economic reasons doesn't cause, migrants or refugees to leave.
Very quickly
these
before we
spaces.
move from this, Jackson, do you fear that this problem will persist because there's no realistic resolution?
Absolutely. The AU and other member countries have not really spoken frankly about the causes of why these people continue to take, to risk their lives to flee to Europe, to go to Europe. And so unless they start having those conversations, realistic conversations, honest conversations amongst themselves, member bodies, why is Europe having meetings about Africans coming to on their continent without the role of the African Union? Where is the African Union voice? Why isn't the African Union being at the forefront of resolving this crisis?
Exactly. I mean, the fact that people can risk dying, sometimes they know they will probably not make it, but they have to leave. And there has to be a compelling reason, right?
We've talked about the push factors. What are some of the push factors? Exactly. Why is it that people are willing to take the risk?
You know what? We're just kind of highlighting a bit of this. We'll continue with that conversation another time. But right now to the political crisis in South Sudan. In mid-December, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir asked his nation's citizens to forgive him for past mistakes. Kiir also ordered government forces to observe a ceasefire and create a conducive environment for communities to reconcile. However, the country remains tense, and human rights organizations warn of a possible genocide. Now, let's continue this conversation here. Another really tragic kind of story went on and on and on. And Salem, again, why? Why did we have to have this big story going on, running throughout the year?
Unfortunately, the continent's youngest country has had another tumultuous year. South Sudan had a peace agreement, an ongoing peace agreement that fell short last July. It seems like leadership is falling behind, and you know, South Sudan didn't have a lot of infrastructure to begin with. You hear stories of hospitals that were built just after independence being demolished because of the war, and so very little infrastructure is under scrutiny, taking the country decades backwards. And so you see a very sad tumultuous
And a kind of
year
a
for
combination of all
2016.
that, you know, there's the violence, the lack of infrastructure. The
Right.
country never had an opportunity to develop.
It's so sad that we
Never had
rooted
a
for South
chance.
Sudan. We
Yeah.
rooted for it. We were there when they're forming this new government. It felt like a baby to all of us.
Exactly, yeah.
And you know, it's so sad that the main protagonists in these fights are people who enjoy, you know, lavish lifestyles. We know the report that came out a couple of months ago talking about some of the money that has been, some of the resources that have been planted by both sides in the conflict. These people live comfortable lifestyles when millions of people are dying and suffering in South Sudan, and they continue to suffer because there's no interest whatsoever on both sides to come to an agreement.
And these leaders, they have been accused of actually having their families live in other
outside.
countries.
Absolutely.
They live outside of South Sudan.
While over 2+ million people are internally displaced or going to other countries. I also want to mention international efforts. International efforts are also falling short. All these peacekeeping missions are not really materializing. And so you see really the country taking a step backward.
But sometimes you wonder, you know, is there some kind of fatigue, frustration from the international community? Because Jackson, I've spoken to so many of these leaders from both sides. All they do is to blame each other. But you don't feel like
at the end of the day, the
trying to solve the
international
problem.
community can do so much. If there's no willingness within the country itself, within the major players, within the leadership of either the rebels or the people at the, you know, in the presidency, Salva Kiir, if there's no willingness to come to the table and talk peace, you know, the people will continue to suffer.
And the international
So
community has
the international
limited
community can
kind of
do so little, really.
If I would like to add, you know, what really worries me about South Sudan is how these grievances have come in ethnic lines. And so the majority, Dinka and Nuer, are, of course, on top and news. But the fact that these the fights against each other based on ethnicity is something to really take a closer look at and to be worried about in the coming
And that's
years.
a very critical point, actually. I wanted to bring it up, that once it takes an ethnic dimension, which South Sudanese are saying it has actually, it becomes very difficult to resolve. But again, some say the leadership is more about the ego of men, just a few men, and the people are just collateral damage, right?
Right. I mean,
right.
remember, this conflict has two major players. Riek Machar, who is right now in South Africa. I don't know under what circumstances. South Africa said they were really holding him there. I don't know whether they're detaining him. Salva Kiir obviously came out with that big statement a couple of weeks ago asking for forgiveness. He deserves to ask for forgiveness. I mean, the people of South Sudan need a break from this war.
Indeed. I just hope that 2017 will give us kind of some different story to cover.
Absolutely.
Than
We need
Sudan.
better stories than war
than
stories,
that.
yes.
Well, now let's switch gears here. There were nearly 20 presidential elections in Africa in 2016. Former African Union Chairman Jean Ping, an ally turned critic of Gabon's President Ali Bongo, hoped to break the ruling party's nearly 50-year grip on power. He lost. Ghana and Benin stood out as the most peaceful and democratic, while Uganda was mired by violence as President Yoweri Museveni won another term, extending his 30 years in power. Gambia's elections results remain disputed. Well, now another story. The election thing. Every year, every time we have an election in Africa is a tense moment. Now we have 20, close to 20 in total. Why are you surprised by any? Salem, did anything come out possibly surprise you in a good way or a bad way?
Well, what we're seeing in Africa, I think, you know, the era of strong men is somewhat in decline, where, you know, constitutions have been amended. You see, even today, Burundi's Nkurunziza was addressing a crowd, and he said he is considering to run in 2020, and verbatim he says, if that's what the people want. We've seen this before. You know, Rwanda is one example we can think of. But I think that, you know, this farcical, stereotypical understanding of what African leadership is like, you know, strong men holding power for a very long time, I think we're seeing an end to it because the people are really understanding. I don't know. I'm
mean,
trying to be as positive
honestly,
as possible.
He doesn't seem to agree. We know that Benin, we know that Ghana maintained its character.
Exactly.
We expected that.
The positive
Jackson
outcomes
says,
of-
well,
There are very many, examples to draw from. Uganda. There were so many almost presidents in this past year.
That's true.
There were elections. There are sending signals that there's progressive elements in these governments. However, when you look at the elections in Uganda, the shutdown of social media, the presidential candidate who supposedly, who many say that won the election, but has been in perpetual house arrest for how many months after Jean Ping in Gabon, another almost president. Then the creme de la creme, the story of Gambia,
I mean,
winning,
exactly.
losing an election, calling his opponent and conceding defeat,
and then
we're all very happy with say, we have a happy moment. 2016, one of those feel-good stories about politics, political feel-good stories in Africa was Gambia, the president Yahya Jammeh picking up the phone on TV and making, calling Barrow, his opponent, and say, I concede defeat. 1 week later,
changes mind. We almost got a pleasant surprise. Let's get your final word from you on this.
But you can't really pass the DRC Congo, which is a very important, big country to look at. If you think about stereotypical understanding of what African leadership looks like, of course, Burundi and DRC Congo come to mind. You see, President Kabila saying that he's not going to positioning himself for
he has
a third
one more
term.
year in power.
Exactly, and then it shows that that it has more consequences. The EU and the US imposing sanctions on inner circles of Kabila. But aside from that, I remain optimistic. Even when Yahya Jammeh says, I am going to.
Who knows? Maybe it will surprise us the beginning of the year.
Exactly.
But you know what?
Vincent, ECOWAS. We need to give it up to ECOWAS. By the way,
we'll wait for what they say after that. Well, Salem and Jackson, VOA correspondents here, we want to thank you very much. The excellent insights so far on Africa.